He really embodies the spirit of Soviet confrontation with the United States, using the United States as a scapegoat. Sanctions against a dictator can strengthen him among his own people. He desires confrontation. In his first presidential speech, 2000, he said the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union.
You talked about the Russians. Do you think that the Russians are our biggest threat right now?
President Obama, like President Bush, came into office naive about the Russians, about Putin, who's a hardcore Soviet KGB guy at his core. Bush infamously looked into the eyes of Putin and said he saw his soul.
Oh, yes.
It's a problem among Republican voters where they think mistakenly it's a made-up issue. The 2012 debate between Barack Obama and Romney, he laughed at Romney, Governor Romney, now senator actually, former governor, now senator, when he correctly identified the Russians as a greatest geopolitical threat. So among Trump supporters, they're like, the Democrats laughed at Romney, and now because they can link him to the Trump, it's a hoax, and they never really cared about the Russians. But that is actually not true. Obama 100% was naive when he laughed at Governor Romney, now Senator Romney, former governor at that time, by the way. The Obama administration was also forced to acknowledge that the Russians were violating the most important nuclear treaty signed between Gorbachev and Reagan, called the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty. Basically, what it involves is putting intermediate range nuclear missiles into a Russian enclave in Europe called Kaliningrad, which is being fortified with nuclear weapons and other weapons. Why are intermediate missiles such a big deal when intercontinental missiles can hit the United States, anywhere in the United States or anywhere in the world in 30 minutes, is Reagan and Gorbachev understood that it was uniquely destabilizing because these missiles hit in 8 minutes instead of 30 minutes. So why? When Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, did Putin choose to violate the most important treaty signed between Reagan and Gorbachev, trying to prevent, God forbid, some sort of incident between Russia and the United States, then, of course, the Soviet Union, because he wanted to threaten Europe once again with nuclear attack, even understanding the history that what's known as the Euro missile crisis was even more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Americans think the Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous crisis because the Euro missile crisis was more complicated. The history that the Soviet leader Brezhnev probably introduced, I should say, nuclear missiles in Europe, intermediate missiles. The Europeans were freaked out because they could be annihilated in 8 minutes. They went to the US looking for help, and Democratic President Jimmy Carter and Republican President Ronald Reagan responded with their own intermediate missiles. The Russians said it was like a gun to their heads. Usually when they say stuff like that, that's a lie. But we did have a friend at the helm of Russia, our only friend ever who was a Russian leader, Gorbachev, and it was not a lie. So Reagan and Gorbachev banned. It was the only time in history that an entire class of nuclear weapons are banned. Obama acknowledged this violation. He recognized in the second term the serious right that he didn't recognize previously. The Russians outgun us in battlefield tactical nukes between 4 to 10 times. They have nuclear torpedoes, nuclear-tipped anti-ship missiles. The interceptors defending Moscow are still nuclear-tipped to create an EMP to prevent us from being able to successfully strike Moscow with nuclear weapons. Russia is the only country that could destroy the United States. And so the mutually assured destruction that people will often raise doesn't prevent the Russians from attacking us. It prevents us from credibly threatening massive retaliation, because if a limited war with Russia, even one including tactical nuclear weapons, escalates out of control into a total nuclear war, we could within hours lose 200 million Americans. So if we threaten Russia, even after serious battles with massive retaliations, the Russians led by leaders like Putin can say BS. It's not credible. To a large extent, because the threat is to America's existence. And the only country in the world that threatens our existence is Russia. The problem with us pulling out of the INF Treaty is nobody's going to let us put nuclear-tipped missiles back on their territory. So we can't even take advantage of it. Our Army loves it because it allows them to bring back developed missiles that replace our Air Force and Navy, and they can rely more on their own missiles rather than our Navy and Air Force. But together as a country, we don't need that. It doesn't help us. So a lot of Russian military strategy is deception and misinformation, fake news, and psychological warfare. and turning Americans against each other. They support white supremacists. They support groups that people identify as Antifa at the same time. They send rival groups of Americans through Facebook events to the same location, and they encourage Americans to hate each other and attack each other. And they also try to undermine the credibility of NATO, for example. And so Trump served as their mouthpiece. He was their useful idiot. So this is disinformation. So the next year, he became president of Russia, and he brought back the melody of the Soviet national anthem, which reflected his way of thinking. Of course, he's not really a communist, but he really embodies the spirit of Soviet confrontation with the United States, using the United States as a scapegoat. So that it was really a harbinger for much worse things to come. And Americans in the West in general quickly forgot that it was an attempted Russian intervention in Kosovo, but their intervention in Syria showed it was no fluke, and it wasn't done in a peaceful way. It was done in ways that always brought us to the verge of like almost warfare with the Russians in Syria and almost beyond. And the issue here is that Putin doesn't appear to be afraid of avoiding military confrontations with U.S. forces and allied forces. And that's something we have to be careful. We have an enormous amount of hubris here.
What do the Russians have against us? What motivates them then?
Well, so dictatorships are strengthened by an external enemy. There's that. There is the fact that beyond being former Siloviki, which are former security KGB thugs running the country like Putin, who have that Soviet mentality, it is a Soviet mentality. There's an element of jealousy. The United States is far richer. Russian economy is about the size of Mexico, but the Russians have aspirations to remain a superpower. There is a fact that they have a completely failed economy. This is actually a bad thing from our perspective, a failing economy. And they have enormous power that we disregard. Americans and Europeans have fooled themselves into believing that nuclear weapons don't matter. Basically a lie, that there was a missile gap, that the Russians had more intercontinental missiles than the United States, early 70s. Not true. We had a huge advantage, huge advantage. But those kind of things are not forever. Why is it significant? First of all, it may have played a role, contrary to what the vast majority of Americans believe, into quickly escalating the Cuban Missile Crisis far greater than necessary. If you can hit the Soviet Union in 30 minutes with 200 missiles, or maybe 1,000, I forget what it is, it diminished. It didn't mean that Russian missiles in Cuba weren't necessarily a threat. But the irony is everyone captured, or many people captured from college or high school classes, that the missile gap, which was JFK's claim, was false. What they didn't understand is by the 70s, it was real. It was real. And we've never really overtaken the Russians since. In the early 80s, we developed an advantage, or intercontinental missiles, which are basically space vehicles. They have reentry vehicles. We could hit the targets more accurately than the Russians. That's significant because when you have a hardened underground military site, even with nuclear warheads, you need accuracy because the nuclear explosion's above ground. If you miss, because you're talking about rock, hard rock, you're not going to destroy the missile silo. They'll be able to fire back. So there was that. But there's just been a lot of oversimplicity. There is a myth of 100 nukes magically destroying the world, which is entirely nonsense. There was a legitimate issue of, obviously, Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. I'm just saying in regards to that, it may have been escalated too quickly by JFK based on the continuing lie that the Russians had more intercontinental missiles, which they didn't. The trick here, I think we sort of talked about this in regards to Cuba maybe, or maybe this was a different show, is that
or maybe it was a off-camera conversation.
Probably. Sanctions against a dictator can strengthen him again among his own people.
Yes.
And, by the way, Russia's different than Cuba, though. It is physically the largest country in the world. So Biden is going to reestablish American commitment to the institutions that Democratic and Republican presidents honored, act like a normal American president. He's going to stand by our military commitments. The problem that I think that the elephant in the room really is that it is very hard to deal with a country that literally has 1,600 large nuclear weapons pointed at our cities that hit in 30 minutes. So in terms of sanctions, I actually believe that Putin wants sanctions.
Really?
did not want sanctions.
That's a very extravagant statement.
What? Sorry?
It's a very extravagant statement.
Well, extravagant means undeserved, and it means like really baseless or something. So I don't think extravagant is the right word. No, I believe that
bold. It's a bold assessment.
Yeah, but not baseless or not surprising.
No, but I understand. I completely understand where you're coming from.
In political science, there is a strong theory, suspicion that sanctions strengthen the bad guy, the bad dictator. Okay. But you have to weigh it. If you do
rally around the flag phenomenon.
That's part of it. Rally around the flag. But if you do nothing, I think even with Russia, we have a quandary. We appear weak. If Putin did not want sanctions, he would not be playing the horrible games he was playing during the Trump administration. President Trump expressed affinity, adoration, ultimate support for Putin. He said he was a friend. I mean, it was kind of sick. It was kind of stupid. It was kind of crooked. He actually thought that Putin was going to hand him a re-election in 2020, but it was there. If Putin wanted a friend in the White House, he could have had him. And he's
because Trump always tried to, his managing style was always that one based on personal friendships with everyone and all that.
With Putin, there was far more to it, and it was very stupid, and it was very self-destructive, and it will ultimately come out the extent, as you know, former CIA and national security advisors have said. But the point is, Putin is not stupid. I think he's very smart. Just sometimes he is more evil than people want to admit, and more ruthless than people want to admit. Basically, the things that the Russians did during the Trump administration and during the Obama administration are not the ways to get sanctions lifted. They're not operating based on narrow Russian economic interest or national interest. They're a strategy of confrontation. I mean, you talk about extravagant, gratuitous, basically intervening wherever American forces are, to the point where we were constantly near collisions. It's almost a miracle that no Russian plane has crashed into an American plane or ship. You don't do these things if so the central to like the kind of backstory of the Mueller investigation was a meeting between representatives of the Russian government and intelligence with Trump family members and Trump campaign people at Trump Tower. And it is usually understood that they were negotiating to have Russian sanctions lifted. But they're just easier ways. You just don't throw salt in our wounds or spit in our eyes constantly. This is what Putin is doing in Syria, supporting the Syrian dictator and murdering children with nerve gas. The Russians really had their fingerprints on it. Things that don't have to do with, yes, they have a military base in Syria, potentially of some limited military value, but they're actually going out of their way to cause confrontation with the United States. They're actually triggering confrontations. Poisoning people in England, constantly if his goal was peace and no sanctions, don't look like have constant military rehearsals of invading and even nuking American allies in Europe.
Now that you're talking about all the tactics that Putin might be employing to essentially stay in power, do you think the Russians had anything to do with the supposed sonic attacks on the U.S. and Canadian diplomatic personnel in the Cuban embassy?
Yes, and they also...
American embassy in Havana.
But it also occurred in China as well.
How so?
We had, I believe, diplomats who had suffered similar injuries.
Similar symptoms?
In China, yes. I think it was China and Cuba. And it wasn't necessarily sonic. Scientists have been going back and forth between sonic, microwave, or saying that both could not have possibly created it. It's just a weird coincidence. I suspect it was an attack. And if it was an attack, it probably was Russian. I think that many people do, actually.
But why would the Russians do that again?
Well, the Washington Post a few years ago actually reported that Russian diplomats were breaking into American diplomats' apartments in Western Europe and basically pooping on their carpet.
Oh, Lord, that's so graphic.
Yeah, but
is it to send a symbol or something, a message?
Yeah, I think that why are the Russians flying Bear bombers over the Arctic rehearsing firing nuclear-tipped air-launched cruise missiles at the American homeland? Why are they leaking, building a doomsday bomb that would devastate American city with radioactive waste for 100 years? Yeah, I actually do believe that he wants sanctions because he's not an idiot. He could just
Russia, right. That it's quite. You're saying that it would be quite easy if he had the political will to do that.
I mean, his desire,
it's within his power of doing so.
He desires confrontation. In his first presidential speech, 2000, he said the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was characterized less by its larger borders than by its strategy of confrontation with the West, particularly the United States, or at least in his KGB outlook. And so the sanctions actually create a Russia more isolated from the West, particularly the United States. And I think he kind of desires that. I mean, yes, they're economic.
But that you mentioned desire. Do you mean for political gain or more like a cultural, personal mission sort of thing?
Both. I mean, I think he is culturally Soviet in ideology, and there are older Russians who have that cultural ideology. Yeah. But you also talked about rally around the flag, and that is a danger that even among young Russians, that as confrontations between the Russians and Americans, if they heat up, more Russians will be drawn into that kind of thinking. There's just a thinking, the KGB had this famous operation globally to convince the world that the CIA created HIV. And we have the documents to prove it.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, while that was largely aimed outside of the Soviet Union, that type of thinking is very popular among Russians. You can go to Sunny Isles. If you talk to a bunch of them, the more immersed in the kind of native Russian culture, the more that they'll say it's probably true or start insisting that it's true. Because I've had Russians tell me in Florida that Putin was protecting the world from President Obama's aggression and asking me why was President Obama trying to start a war with Russia. Now, President Obama somewhat naively tried to achieve a reset. He mistakenly thought the confrontation with Putin was because this KGB thug was angry that President Bush wasn't multilateral enough, that this KGB guy was upset that he didn't go to the United Nations, which is obviously ridiculous. And now we see Putin invade two countries, first Georgia and then Ukraine. In dealing with adversaries like Assad in Syria, or the Iranians, the United States has this overwhelming power that's completely unopposed. And the Chinese are unwilling, thankfully, maybe because they share our interests probably overall, and lack that capability to threaten right now America's existence. But when we're dealing with the only existential threat to America, suddenly we have like a very serious problem, and it's scary. But I don't want to leave anyone thinking that our homeland is threatened. I'm sure Putin understands that the one thing he cannot do, God forbid, is to attack an American target. He will not do that, I predict with absolute certainty, because we have our nuclear weapons on our subs 24/7 to warn him, don't make that mistake. But but we can't make the threat because it is reciprocal. It's a mutually assured destruction that many people understand, but it goes both ways. So if they start using nuclear artillery, we can't really threaten Russia either, even though it looks like he would be the one, well, I can guarantee you, he would be the one triggering the war. Because we're not a Russian mafia KGB state. We have a successful economy, and unfortunately, they have a failed economy. Understand one thing. It was entirely the objective of the Bill Clinton administration to create a successful democratic capitalist state in Russia. We wanted a prosperous Russia. They think we deliberately sabotaged their economy.
Yeah, because that didn't really happen. Yes.
But understand that the Bill Clinton administration,
people died of cold and starvation.
What?
That many Russians died of cold and starvation.
Well, you had when the mafia took over. That's when the Russian mafia took over, but they have consolidated power under Putin. And all the Russian experts, except for one conspiracy theorist, will tell you that the effort from the Bill Clinton administration was very, very sincere. They wanted a prosperous, modern Russia, but they didn't have the historical foundation.
The knowledge?
The foundation. United States and Great Britain have 400 years of commercial law. They compared it to a Band-Aid. You peel the Band-Aid off, the faster the better. It's called shock therapy. The United States and Great Britain, it's older than our Constitution, have 400 years of common law foundation behind our private enterprise. Russia was under the czars and serfdom before the Soviet Union. It was never a capitalist country. And we were trying to create a capitalist democracy. I mean, it is the ultimate tragedy. And it was not intended to create the largely corrupt billionaire oligarch class that was created, the people who took over the factories overnight and were able, and that doesn't mean they were completely bad, completely wrong, but that's not a result favorable to democracy and capitalism. And Putin represents the most hardline elements of the Soviet military KGB complex. And it's actually scary because before 1990, if a guy like Putin took over the Soviet Union, we would be scared, maybe terrified. We were lucky that Gorbachev, the one kind of guy that we could have never imagined could take over the Soviet Union, did take over. So it wasn't complete hubris to believe that we could sponsor a modern democracy that was prosperous in Russia. It's just that Russia did not have, for example, the democratic history. Well, I'm not going to actually. That's complicated. I guess maybe it was a miracle that things went well in Germany and Japan and Korea, but it worked. You have to try. You have to try to do well. But honestly, anyone who ever tells you we were trying to destroy the Russian economy is either brainwashed, a propagandist, or
right. It's just that these types of sorts of meddling into a country's future like that, many lessons can be learned as to the method. Obviously, the shock doctrine thing, it just doesn't work in the long run, and it's harmful for people. There are other ways of advancing American interests without causing
we weren't trying to
power vacuum, like what happened in Iraq and another situation.
No, but in terms of Russia, we weren't trying to just advance American interests. And notice that virtually all of the Soviet client states turned successful. Now we have a backwards movement in terms of democracy, in terms of Hungary and Poland now, unfortunately.
Yes,
but overall, up to this time, the countries that were Soviet client states, occupied forcibly, brutally sometimes by Soviet forces, were successes. And the United States also sponsored it. Even Poland, because I know that now they're having difficulties. It's COVID. It's like a global economic crisis. But if you look at Czechoslovakia, Poland, these were just not failures of the United States.
Would you say then that the difference between those countries and the same method was applied to all these other countries? So I'm guessing, since you mentioned the history of Russia, that these other countries that turned out to be more successful in their transition from one system to the next had the benefit of already having a history that allowed a smoother transition? Is that what you're talking about?
I think absolutely that the memory was never lost.
That people were just more ready for it.
Yeah, I mean, many of these countries had democratic elections before the Soviets invaded in 1945, liberating them from Nazis. Let's give the Russians the credit. And that's
definitely.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a major source of national pride on the part of the Russians. But the leader was Stalin. And so you had a brutal military occupation. The KGB was very good and still is in its new form of meddling and subverting democratic and capitalist institutions. But you had this cultural memory in most of these countries of democratic elections, of advanced legal systems, and even occupied by the Soviets, these countries seem to manage to be wealthier than Russia. Some of it's also a little fluky, so it's hard to be sure. But it's true that the European Union and NATO admitted these countries and not Russia. So Russia felt.
Yeah, I was just going to add, sometimes you do want to make an example of certain countries. Like, quite obviously, it benefits NATO or the United States that these other countries are successful. That way we can talk positively about them.
And we never really thought that we're harming Russian interests, but Yeltsin reacted by saying he would start targeting American cities with nuclear missiles again. And that was Yeltsin, who we thought was our friend, who we supported.
Yes, a great ally.
Gorbachev was still the leader of the Soviet Union. I think we picked the wrong horse, but he started to threaten, he was corrupt, he was an alcoholic, and he put Putin in power, but he started to threaten us. But,
why do you think this is, we're just dragging this on, but why do you think Yeltsin picked Putin? What was it about Putin's character, personal history? I've always been a little bit baffled as to why. Was it? Do you think maybe it was like some sort of repentant from his Russian side that Putin would be the right man to bring back that Russian pride? Or I mean,
No,
do you have any personal theory on that?
That's a great question. A great question that is very important to ask. Very interesting, great question. So I wanted to just add really quickly one thing to consider. Remember that Yugoslavia was never a Soviet client state. Their army was built to stop a Soviet Warsaw Pact invasion of Yugoslavia. So it was not intuitively obvious to us before intervening to stop the massacre of Muslims in Kosovo by Serbs that Russia would identify. Just that Putin was manipulating. You know, Putin, by the way, I think it's important to say, when he was prime minister, I forget whether I think he might have been Yeltsin's third prime minister, it appears that Putin bombed apartment buildings in Moscow to blame it on Chechens. So Putin seemed angry in Russian television that Russians died because of bombings in Moscow. But, you know, this is the one conspiracy theory that appears to be true. He appeared to have bombed apartment buildings. So he's enraged on TV claiming Chechen terrorists did it.
And he was going to find them even in the latrines. Are you referring to that little press conference that he gave?
Yes, he seemed, he was like enraged.
He was going to go all out and do the impossible.
They're animals. But the animals were led by Putin. Now, I mean, that's not to say that you don't have terrorist extremists and even Chechen extremists, but the vast preponderance of evidence is Putin and the FSB did it. Why did Yeltsin put him in power? Because the guy was crooked. He was afraid that he would face prosecution and imprisonment. The guy and his associates were crooked, like much of most officials in Russia back then and now. And the second thing is, we don't really know. At that point, I mean, the bizarre thing is you really can't eliminate the possibility that he felt like by the time Putin had become prime minister, that if he had not been president, he might die or his family might die. We really don't know. Is Putin that? I mean, Putin has shown, does he have loyalty to people? He's managed to maintain some friendships over the decades. But if you were president of Russia or I were president, and we had family members that we loved and we cared for, and we made the mistake or we found ourselves in the situation that we had put Putin in as prime minister, and he had retained most of his KGB connections and he'd grown. His KGB connections had grown since the collapse of the Soviet Union for Putin. Would have been good for Yeltsin's family to not put, you know, when Putin was appointed as prime minister, since other prime ministers seemed to not have any significance, nobody took it seriously. That was a mistake. But we don't know. I'm being very speculative. But you know, within the realm of possibilities is that that Yeltsin was personally threatened. The common assumption, the conventional explanation, most popular, which is very, very possible, true, or if not actually likely, is simply that Putin chose a guy who promised not to prosecute him. Yeltsin
picked him, right? So it's very likely, yes, very likely.
But could there be more? I mean, couldn't he have found somebody less scary, less ruthless, who could have given him a reliable commitment not to prosecute him?
I think my personal theory is that in his decadence, sick, corrupt, obviously knowing that he was responsible for so many things that were just getting out of hand and just so spinning out of control and with problems, I think that, yes, it has to do with no prosecution. That obviously helped him a lot. But I think that he specifically chose Putin because Putin was that boring type of personality that he probably felt more confident that he could lean on, you know, the more responsible, oh, I don't drink type of KGB type of character that would, they probably talked like, yes, we will get the people or confront the United States for doing this to the motherland, and who knows what kind of like patriotic jargon maybe Putin gave Yeltsin, a dying man, what he wanted to hear. But this has been very fun, Michael, but we really should be signing off at this point. So Thank you so much for your time and your analysis. Take care.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.